My next guest is a fitness coach, a published author, a filmmaker, and an accomplished independent combat sports journalist. He joins me right now from New South Wales, Australia. Good morning, Jonny Stofko. Thank you for being here.
What's up, Tyler? Thank you for having me on the podcast, man. It's always a great time catching up with you.
I have been looking forward to doing this with you for about a year. Our schedules are crazy, but it's good to just sit down and bang this out. And I wanted to first start off and frame for my audience and just kind of tell them kind of who you are. And in the amount of time that I've known you, you have so many feathers in your hat, but I predominantly think of you as a storyteller. You have interviewed some of the biggest names in combat sports. You've interviewed Evander Holyfield. You've interviewed Hoist Gracie. You've interviewed George Foreman.
Mhm.
And I want to like tap into like all of your story telling abilities and how you've been able to like build your brand. But before we do all that, you have a new book coming out. It comes out later in October, and it's called the 24-hour reset. Can you tell everyone a little bit about kind of who you are and what your book's about?
Excellent. Yeah. So, at my who I am as a person, at my root, I just frame everything that I do. Thanks for listing all that stuff up. It's kind of weird hearing it from another person, but I help people, and one of those things that I do is I coach. So people pay me for my services to assist them with either getting them to a baseline of feeling good about themselves, keeping them there, or a lot of people have never felt good. So creating a system for them, whether it's how they exercise, how they sleep, their daily habits, and introducing them, a feasible system for them to live well. And that's what my second published book is about. It does come out in October. It's called the 24-hour reset, like you said. And it was inspired during, Sydney. I live in Sydney, New South Wales. Like the whole world, we experienced, the COVID lockdowns. There were some really strict restrictions down here the second time around. When it hit in March 2020, seemed the whole world, we got caught off guard. And then by the following year, it seemed everybody was kind of kicking back in gears. We got locked down again in June 2021. And that's the one that kind of hit me pretty tough. We weren't allowed to leave our houses 5 kilometers away from our house. So 3 miles. We weren't allowed to travel 3 miles. It was chaos. So all in all that's aside, we all got through it, thankfully. And I thought to myself, what am I doing every day in my daily life that I might take for granted that comes easy to me that I'm not giving away or that I'm not sharing? So I started documenting from the time little things, small little details that when we get into the groove of life, I don't want to say it comes easy to us, but we might take for granted. And I documented that from the time I woke up to the time I went to bed. I put it all together, and that's this book. Basically, 8 habits, tasks that you might want to call it, and I tell it in a story form. I interviewed people, gathered, reached out my contact list, and for each chapter, for each step that I do, I then equally attach like an expert, a scientist to that sort of habit for you, the reader, to take with you. So you won't need any money. There's no magic pill. You don't have to buy anything. There's no supplements, little things. And, I'll wait till the book comes out for you to feel, find out. You can go to, if you Google the name, my publisher has the sort of pitch online, and it's Shawline Publishing. If you want to check that out, you'll read the synopsis.
What did you learn about yourself as you were writing your book?
That I literally, man, it's wild to look at perspectives on how I used to live versus how I live now. I used to be a bartender on the Strip in Las Vegas before I moved to Australia. So my shifts wouldn't start until now. I go to bed. Like I'll go to bed at 9 p.m., 10 p.m., and a lot of shifts wouldn't start till then. And then inverse to that, I wouldn't go to bed some nights ever. Living in Las Vegas, it's exactly what you would think if you've never been there. I lived there for 2 years. I went there for a weekend and stayed there for 2 years. I write about that in my first book, Ungoogleable. It's that one there. You can find that one. But where I am now, it was a conscious decision. So what I learned about myself in this process was we're our harshest critic, I think. And if we're not, we need to get ourselves to that point. We have to be able to look at ourselves reflectively in the mirror, per se, or literally, and if you want to get better in life, if you want to be a better husband, boyfriend, coach, speaker, whatever, we have to constantly dissect our behaviors and fine tune things, just like fighters do, from fight camp to fight camp. And I kind of taken that approach, dissecting little things about my behaviors, because it's all about behaviors with us if we want positive outcomes. It's the little small things. It's not what we say, it's literally, cliches aside, the actions that we take place. So I realized that nobody told me to do this either. I think a lot of us sometimes will get lost in waiting for a change or somebody to guide us or help us. Unbeknownst to us, until we make that step, we have the power to do these things ourselves. It just takes that look in the mirror and dissecting, bit by bit. If you really want to get better, if you want, better, living a better day, feeling better about yourself, relationships, it all comes down to what we do.
Jonny, part of the reason why I wanted you to be on the show is because your wealth of knowledge when it comes to combat sports and how it's covered, also in the media space. It's a very niche thing that I feel is deceptively inclusive. It is not at all, actually. This is a very difficult niche to survive in, whether you're on the fighting side of it or also if you're on the media side of it like me. I'd love to get your perspective when you look at like this niche and how it's kind of exploded in popularity in the COVID era. What are some of the things that you see in terms of just the explosion of content on social media and on YouTube?
Well, if we look at the content initially as its own entity, it's everywhere because technology is at our fingertips. If you want to be a creator, if you want to be somebody who consumes it, if you want to be a person who wants to get your word across and your voice heard, we've never lived in a better time in our lives in human history to do that. So that's a possibility. There obviously are downsides to that if you're coming from a perspective of quality content, who to believe, am I being lied to? Because there really are no sort of gatekeepers, which from a freelance side of things, I'm glad there isn't. If you're talking niche now, it's been awesome to watch you grow your platform over the last few years from literally an idea, a thought, a passion project to now what it is today and what it's going to become. And that is strictly circled around intention and your own sort of reasoning on nobody's telling you what to do. Nobody's motivating you when you feel the views aren't where they should be. You know what you want to achieve long term, so that's all the motivation you need to keep on going. That being said, I started interviewing fighters in 2016, and since then I've had 2 different shows, iTunes, Spotify, all fighters. I didn't go to school for communications. I didn't go to school to interview people. I was sports psychology was my education background, and my intentions were strictly around wanting to learn. Always was a fight fan, grew up boxing. My generation, I don't want to age you, but I was born, in the 1993 when UFC 1 happened, I was 11. So it's literally the only sport of my life, my existence that I've got to see originate and evolve. Everything else was already here. American football here, baseball is here, basketball here, boxing, older than all 3. So watching MMA evolve, watching the UFC evolve, it's been awesome to see, right? Now, wanting to break into that as a journalist, we know, and if you don't know, I mean, it's no secret. The reason why you hear the same voices, the reason why you see the same faces on all the press conferences is because that's by design. Those people are picked. You have a pass. And who are they picked by? There is one, the gatekeeper, Dana. And my issue with that is and will always be, how could there ever be an authentic narrative around what the fighters are doing, what the fighters have done, what is happening in the upcoming sport? How could this ever be an authentic, clean, genuine narrative if the voices interviewing aren't authentically sort of embraced? And they're not. And let's not sugarcoat. They're not. That narrative that UFC generates is a well thought out, manufactured, constructed one. I knew that in 16. That's something that I've spoken to you off record about since I've met you about, because I've seen you pop in and out to regional promotions, bigger promotions. You've written articles for huge organizations and done features on great fighters. potential champions, former champions, etc. But I mean, the goal would one day, I mean, the UFC has a shine about it.
Mm-hmm.
When I realized that as a journalist, as somebody who is intrigued by the athletes and the interconnections of the sport, when I realized that that has nothing to do with how far I get into the UFC, like don't use that as a gauge to compare my success to. When I realized that didn't matter, then it was much more freeing on who I wanted to talk to, who, like you said, who some people, if you've never interviewed a fighter and you want to start interviewing MMA fighters, UFC fighters, you might think, oh, why would they talk to me? Why wouldn't they talk to you? I mean, the coolest thing about the whole game is the documentation, the storytelling side. It's what I love. When you say storytelling, for me, it encapsulates a journey, documenting. It's like Joseph Campbell originated the hero's journey. He's the guy who you know, Star Wars. I'm not a Star Wars guy, but the whole hero starts here, goes up, loses everything, starts from scratch. That's called the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell created that. And this is something that as journalists we get to do with fighters. If you meet a fighter that is either in the back end of the career, like a Marlon Moraes, he still has a story, an incredible one. And it's honorable to tell that story in a positive light. If you meet a fighter, you know, that has one pro fight, you get to tell that story no matter where that ending finishes. There's always an origin. And I think that's a duty to an Ariel Hawani or a guy like myself or you to do it in the way I view it, utmost respect for the sport and the fighter. And I do kind of you'll only ever see me get heated on online discussions or forums if I'm going after a journalist who's talking shit about a fighter, because that fire is, and I see, you know, I cover boxing a lot too, and I see it more in boxing than MMA. It's interesting that that's a thing. Boxing journalists seem more keen to talk reckless about fighters using adjectives like bum or tomato can or washed up. When I see that, I go after the journalist because I'm like, mate, have you ever laced anything? Have you ever been punched? Have you ever risked everything? Or you've just sat behind a keyboard and spoken your sad emotions and projecting them onto this athlete that you've never met or would say these things face to face. And so all of that, there's a story within all of this. And I've never really cared what to compare myself to, sort of like to deter me to tell that story. Like nothing has ever deterred me. If there's I'm motivated and inspired by telling the story, whether it's about a sport, a fighter, or something that's happened in my own life.
If there's like somebody out there in Australia, Youngstown, Ohio, Europe somewhere, and they're
Oh
looking
yeah.
and they're looking at like getting started in this space. There you go. They're looking at getting started in this space before they even make an Instagram handle or build their brand, or before they even turn on a mic and ask a fighter for an interview. Are there some like a basic checklist or some things that they must do before they get started in your mind?
100%. The checklist that I would suggest is you must answer this question to yourself. What is your intention? That has kind of been hijacked by the spirituality, a sector of social media, this word intent. Intention, a mentor of mine years ago once gave me one of the greatest pieces of advice for creating. He said, Johnny, whenever you're going to either write something, interview someone, tell a story, you need to answer intent versus attent. So your intention versus attention. Are you telling this? Do you want to get involved in this? Because your intention is to A, B, or C, and whatever it is, you have to identify that. Or are you doing this because you want the attention of what that outcome might bring? Now, that recipe and formula, in order for it to be positive and you feel good about yourself and do good or great work down the road, it's not going to be great initially. Down the road, it has to be positively 100% intention over attention. So if we did a mathematical equation, intent over attent, 100%. Now you're not done. You have to answer, what is my intention? And mine has always been, anybody who's listened to either one of my shows, read any of the books, or hear me talk, it's always been wanting to learn. So my first podcast was called the Vision Board Podcast. I had just got moved from Vegas to Australia. I co-hosted it with a guy I met at the gym named Tristan. He was a finance guy, a stockbroker, and I was a personal trainer. We had never interviewed people before, and we started reaching out to people. And before you know it, I mean, we had done this was in 2016. People weren't podcasting in Australia. We did CBS. We got flown to New York City, 40 episodes in to interview Joe DeFranco for the Industrial Strength Show. We did Hoist Gracie, the first interview I'd ever done in person, because it was we were using Skype in 16. We were Skype guys. And over time, people were like, let's do it in person. And I write about this in the first book, the whole Hoist story. And I watched this guy as a kid. You know, this guy, I didn't grow up watching comic books or reading comic books. I've never been into superhero films or like sci-fi. My superheroes were guys like Ken Griffey Jr. on the baseball field, Hoist Gracie grappling. And he messages us and says, hey, I'm in Sydney doing a seminar. Let's do this at this dojo. And mate, I get goosebumps telling the story. Just like that, I'm in an octagon being asked by Hoist to take the shoes off. I've never interviewed anybody in person until this. And I was shocked. I'm 5'11", about a buck 80. I was shocked with how big he was, how reverent he was. This dude was like floating. I'm not allowed to have any notes. You know how it is interviewing people. You have your notes, you have your checklist. All of a sudden, I'm not going to be on film with a notebook. Are you kidding? So I'm winging it. And man, talk about lessons learned. You talk about throwing yourself in the deep end. And none of that was planned. Mm-hmm. So it's like we hear these stories about intention and, you know, throwing yourself in the deep end as personal development, but don't look to find steps to do it. These things have to happen organically. You have to put yourself out there. So to long-winded answer, intention. What is your intention? And identify it. If it's wanting to be famous, don't talk to me. And it's not going to work out, because that's a fickle game to play. But if it's something like wanting to learn, wanting to help people, that's always my number two. Wanting to tell a story. It doesn't have to be grandiose. People don't even have to listen to the interviews. I have you'd be shocked with how many interviews I've done that I either haven't released and the guests knew about it, or I've only released a little bit. And I'm like, you know, maybe I shouldn't do a 40-minute. Let me do an 8-minute. These 2 points at this time of my life seem relevant. But now I'm writing the second book. I pulled out interviews from 2018, that I use in my upcoming book about wellness. So intention is everything, guys. And that'll get you through 40 people downloading your show. Why do I have 8 subscribers? If your intention is to learn, none of that shit matters.
You're absolutely right. If from the lens of a fighter, you're an amateur fighter, you're 18, 19 years old, and you're looking at all of this buildup in the combat sports space, how might somebody of that nature take advantage of all of these platforms that are out there?
Now, your equation as a young up-and-coming fighter, the journalist, the podcaster does the intent versus attention. You need to do an equation, abundance over scarcity. And this is another one that, as an entrepreneur, as somebody who helps people get businesses off of the ground, we walk into the same room, right? This young fighter walks into this space, this MMA community, and they'll either ask themselves one or two things. They will see the same landscape. The landscape doesn't change, it's the perspective. The first perspective, which holds the fighter back, is how am I ever going to do this? You know, nobody knows me. I don't have a manager. I don't train in a big gym. I don't even have a career victory. Look at all these fighters around. They're so successful. There's Iridium. There's, first round management. There's all these big, agents, and no one's calling me. Why should I even continue? I'm no one. And then that same fighter sees the same landscape. It doesn't change. And goes, oh my God, look at everything that's happening. Look at all these promotional companies. Look at all these agents, these fight promotions that I could fight under. There's Iridium that could sign me. There's First Round that could sign me. I could be signed. I could fight for these. That is all that matters. You need to look at the opportunity as abundance versus the first one, scarcity. And so many of us, we play a trick on ourselves into thinking that competition is a bad thing. That competition, whether it's you're in real estate, you're opening gyms, you're a fighter, you're writing books, you're doing podcasts, competition is what gets you to the next level. Don't shy away from that. And as a fighter, they would already know these things, but I think sometimes the fighter overlooks the perspective side of wanting to or growing their own career. It holds them back. it's wild to think somebody who watches the sport from the outside, who've never interviewed the fighters, who've never got to know them like you and I have got to know them. It's wild to when you get to know how humble, how much humility, how much patience, and how much sort of, in a lot of ways, hesitance there is from the fighter perspective in all areas of their life, except when the bell rings. Because then when that bell rings, they're literally half naked with the lights on and on the biggest stage, vulnerable at the highest level of vulnerability one could be, and that's where they're comfortable. So
I
it's
know that is wild. I've heard that fighters have actually told me that they have been more nervous to interview with me than they are walking into a cage to fight somebody, which is
yes, yes. I just heard a fighter talk about this exact thing. She high level fighter. She says she's a weird introverted person, harder for her to make friends. But when she's fighting in front of a million people streaming, it's like that's where she's most comfortable. So that's having an abundance mindset. The way we look at things, how we perceive things, literally, I think is the key to the car.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I also find that there's some sort of irony there. I look at all of these brand new platforms that are trying to really carve out a reputation from them for themselves in the MMA media space, and they all do what I feel is a common pitfall. They're all going and trying to hit up and land interviews with all these UFC fighters that are established and have been around for a very long time, when they should be trying to talk to a young amateur fighter or a brand new uh, fighter that's making their pro debut. Like that's the guy that you want to talk to. I almost kind of feel like you're wasting your time on the UFC guys, and you're almost better off hitting up an amateur fighter from your local gym. I feel like that interview is almost always going to be more successful than interviewing some fighter on a UFC fight card. Can you talk about a little bit more? Like that sounds ludicrous to anyone who hasn't been in this space before, but it actually makes sense. And can you be my attorney, Jonny, and explain to the good people out there why it makes sense?
I love this. I love this talking point, and here's why it makes sense. My own personal perspective, I like to only give advice by having done it, and only take advice from people who have done it. So on this exact topic, and it's a great point, Tyler, is in my experience, when I would reach out to Evander Holyfield, Larry Holmes, Rumble Johnson, rest in peace, um, Carlos Condit, when he was the interim welterweight champion in the UFC, and send my pitch to them. It's all about the pitch with those guys and girls. You know, Layla Ali was on my pitch. She's in my first book. It's all about that pitch, guys, and that's a whole nother episode. I've talked to you about the pitch before. Never undervalue your body of work, right? So when I reach out to them, it's like, all right, let's see if my body of work is strong enough for them to say yes. And you're gonna get said no to 100 times. And then I remember when Evander said yes, I screenshot it. I sent it on to my 4 followers on Facebook at the time. I was stoked. Now, my reasoning, I just told you for that, was all about let's see if my threshold, my body of work was strong enough for these people wanting to talk to me, right? Let's see if my pitch was strong enough, the top ones. Now, on the other side, the skill, I remember when I would watch the regional fights streaming on UFC Fight Pass, and I'd see fighters, whether they were just about to make their debut or hadn't fought in the UFC. I'll use 2 specific examples. One still fights in the UFC, one is retired. The first one was Cool Hand Luke Sanders. And Luke was a fighter out of Tennessee, and he hadn't fought in the UFC yet. I just saw his athleticism. You know, he had his cornrows, jacked, bodied up, do my research. He was a former BMX kind of like champion, X Games kid, and so athletic. Reach out to him. He was honored to be on. I ended up interviewing him over the course of his career. He fought in the UFC for about 4 years, has a win over Renan Barao, has a few performance of the night bonuses. His whole thing was he never was really able to get grounded with one specific camp. Went through a bad breakup, which you can look into that with a high celebrity partner. And that's the breaks. But the cool thing about that is watching that kid go from my Instagram at the time at like 21,000 followers. I think Luke had 800. And then watch him win one fight, get to the UFC, become a star, and then us staying in contact. I could text Luke, hit me up maybe a year ago when he was coming to Sydney if I could get him tickets to a comedy show, that sort of stuff. And then a young Ricky Simone. Ricky hadn't fought in the UFC yet. these interviews are on my are up on the podcast and ungoogleable. Interview him. He got so pissed at me because I hadn't seen him really fight yet, and the one fight I did, they were pronouncing his name wrong, and so I learned so much in that because I was like, I was calling him Ricky Simon. And he didn't tell me till after. He texted me, he said, "Hey, it's Simone." I'm like, "Oh, it already came out. This is terrible." So I left it up. But we look at his career. He's a perennial champ. Oh, he just had a tough fight. But my point is intention. It's all about these platforms that are only going after the top dogs. We know their intention. They're not being they think they're not being transparent about it. They want clicks and views. They want people. If you think you can get Connor, you'll get 1 million subs. Yeah, but have you forged the relationship with the viewer? And that's what you have to understand. How are you going to get? It's what I've realized. If I get I've had an interview like 50,000 views, I'll get 400 plus subscribers. But what did I do to keep those subscribers to stay, connected with me? Those people will always fall off. It's the ones who've been with you since the basement that will stay. And it all comes back to how to build healthy relationships. You can't cut corners. And I'll end this with one of my favorite entrepreneurs. It's going to sound out of left field, but the guy who invented Wendy's, Dave Thomas, he didn't pop until his, I think, 60s or 70s as a restaurateur entrepreneur. And he was asked, later in life, why he kept his hamburgers square. McDonald's burgers, Burger King burgers, they're circle. He goes, "Oh, I kept them square so all my employees and all the guests who come in all my restaurants have an example to see how long it took me to pop, that with success, you don't cut corners." And that's why I keep them square. And that's something I've always kept with me.
You are absolutely right. And I kind of wanted to use myself as a case study for anyone who's been with us this far. I've been pretty, for the most part. Well, let me rephrase this. I'm not exactly the most transparent person. There's actually very little that's known about me, and I keep it that way intentionally because this podcast, this entire platform, it ain't about me. But what I will share is it has been one of the most rewarding endeavors, but also one of the most humbling endeavors I've ever embarked on. And I've accomplished a lot in my life. I have the college degrees. I've done a lot. I'm a moderately successful guy, but coming into this space as a complete outsider has been incredibly difficult. And here are a few things I found out along the way. Number one, doesn't matter how good of an interviewer you are. That actually means nothing in this space. It doesn't matter how good of a writer you are. That means nothing in this space either. The one thing that does matter is consistency. And I have been doing this for over 2 years and I've never made a dime off of it either. And I think that's really important for people to understand who are trying to break into this. Like if you're coming into it thinking you're going to get insta famous or you're going to like find this like financial windfall, you need to like probably just get a second job or do something completely different. If those are your motivators, it's probably not going to work out well for you. I say all this because I started this because I just had a genuine curiosity about people in the pipeline and I wanted to learn more about their journeys and learn more about who they were. And the idea was if I could follow them throughout their career, as you alluded to earlier, you're going to see a really cool breadcrumb trail. Like imagine if I knew Conor McGregor back in 2010 or even before that in 2007 when he was still an apprentice plumber in Ireland. And if I had a relationship with him where I was being able to document every single one of those steps along his journey into mega stardom, how cool would that be? Obviously, I don't
And
know.
these things happen.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't know anything about him, but I'm using him as an example. But with all that being said, I ran into some roadblocks, and there were a couple of times where I'm like, I think I'm doing all the right things, Johnny. Like the work is there, the sweat equity is there. I'm doing everything, but why am I not like? Why isn't this thing moving? I'm burning a hole through the screen. The work ethic's there, all my content's there, but I'm just not really seeing it. Like, is this really worth it? And you kind of like walked me back from the cliff here a little bit, and you're like, you told me a few things, and I'm going to kind of put you on the spot. What are some of the things that you saw when you looked at all the things that I was doing, um, we won't spill all the tea, but like, what are some of the course corrections that you remember giving to me that kind of like brought me back and helped me kind of see through the fog a little bit?
Well, one of those things is being able to understand that the effort that you're putting in, the sacrifice, the setting up the interviews, the building the relationships, the continuation of a healthy relationship with the fighter, the positive network, all of this, the branding, the lessons you're learning, how things look visually online for the people who consume your content. All of those things aren't related to what the interview is about. They're related to you growing and progressing as a better interviewer, friend, relationship manager, content creator, social media influencer. So it's all about the things, the lessons that we can't see when we're in it that you feel don't have value. But those are the most valuable things that we're going to get from everything. It's the journey. Once again, it goes back to the journey. So not being so much caught up in the analytics or the data or where is this going, but more embracing the path itself, because the biggest sort of opportunities will come not from one interview. It'll come from that body of work, conversations, somebody you haven't met yet. And once again, I can attest to this. I'm in a dry sauna in 2019 and recovering after a sparring session, and I meet a guy down in the sauna. We start chatting, and I'll spare you the story. I'm sure I've told you. And that conversation led to him talking about podcasts. I told him I hosted one. He goes online, sees all the people I interviewed, reaches back out to me. We become friends. And then within this year and a half period, we travel the world together from Hollywood to Myanmar to Cyprus, and we film a documentary. He's a very successful, well-off angel investor. And that is an example of not my podcast not getting $10,000 a stream like your goal would be, but that body of work, that effort, that discipline, all the relationship stuff I aforementioned, that's how it'll pay off in other ways that you can't see. And so many of us quit before those fruits of the labor start showing its head, because we put ourselves on this time limit. We compare ourselves to people. We hold other people up when we're not really loving ourselves in such a way like, I'm not doing this for anybody else. I'm not trying to sell selfish here, but tell yourself that this has nothing to do with anybody else, everything to do with my own personal journey, my intentions that I've set for myself. Only you guys can answer that. And once we're cool with that and that's locked in, and you know that that's your sturdy sort of personal philosophy, your credo, then you're able to see these different perspectives. And we sometimes just get tricked into thinking that what's in front of us is all that matters.
I'm going to give the last one to you, but I'm going to share two things that you've taught me that has directly impacted the show for the better. Number one, sell your location. That's the number one thing that has given me immense success in Europe and Australia. I will give an example for people who don't know what we're talking about. I am based in the Washington, D.C. area. Anytime I want to talk to a fighter that's not from the United States, namely in Europe or in Australia, the very first thing that's out of my mouth is, my name's Tyler. I have a Washington, D.C. based podcast. I want to tell Americans about Eternal MMA or about.
You're giving all the secrets away. So this is the pitch. This is the pitch. Yeah, this is the pitch. This is what we talked about her. And Tyler, for me to hear you say that, I want to give you a hug, because it's another one of those things. Why it sparked my second book. It's the things we overlook. It's the things we don't see. Why? Because we're tricking ourselves into thinking what's in front of us is the things that matter. No, it's that body of work. Hey guys, this is Tyler. Perfect. It's how do you think I've got? Hey guys, this message is for Layla Ali. My name is Jonny Stofko. I host a show out of Sydney, Australia. Sydney's a sexy sell to Americans. DC's a sexy sell to Europeans. This is a thing. People, we think we're not good enough. You know what I'm saying? Just get started. It's there.
The second big thing that you taught me, you have to reward your listeners. What do I mean by that? You have to give them something they can't get anywhere else. whether that's a unique fact about your guests, getting your guest to talk about something that's raw that they haven't said before. Look at their old interviews, and any time that they have answered a question that's run of the mill, think up of something different. You have to be different. Ask them about something that you can't find on the internet. That's the basic premise of your first book, Ungoogleable. Like, that isn't just like something you pulled out of the sky. The meaning behind that book was to try to get something you can't find anywhere else. That's the whole premise. And that is the other thing I learned from you. Baking both of those things into my interviews has helped immensely. And you could see that in the show. If you watch my shows, you can see that I'm offering something you're just not going to find anywhere else. It's not a copy and paste podcasting format. You have to be different. But there's at least one more. We aren't going to sell away the entire store, but is there one other thing, one other insider tip or trick that you would be comfortable sharing with my audience about how to be a better interviewer?
I'm more like my creative mind will always go to redistribution. So content from a viewer perspective, they're going to have an opportunity to listen to your podcast audio. They're going to have an opportunity to watch your podcast visual YouTube. They're going to have an opportunity to listen to you and see pictures, Instagram, read Twitter. So we have to look as creators, storytellers, look at the modalities of platforms that whatever ones you use. If it's just one, that's fine. But if you're growing a brand, you're going to be using multiple ones. So I like to redistribute the content. I used to do it a lot more in the earlier days. Now I've been able to just streamline. I like the long verse visual side of things. YouTube and the written form now just comes in books. But you take an interview, it's 30 minutes with Tobias Harila, one of my favorite strikers on the planet. Shout out to Tobias, bad intentions. And you take that 30-minute interview. That's one stream of content, right? Put it on YouTube. You take a hot bite, 1 minute, do that as a reel on Instagram. Still the same interview. You're redistributing. You take what he said maybe once about when he's standing in the pocket, and it's the one time where, maybe his eyes do close and he wings a hook, and every now and then it connects. You write that down and put that as a tweet, tag him in it, get shared. These are just examples of, and who taught me this was Gary Vaynerchuk when I interviewed him in 2017. He said, redistribute your content. You've done all the work. You've set it up. You've created this relationship. Why just leave it? Why just give it one opportunity? What else in life do we just one opportunity and that's it? Chop it up. Man, I'll redistribute stuff. Anything I've created. You know what I mean? Dating back to 2016, you'll find I could find something. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. I'm in a creative state right now.
Johnny, before I let you go, I wanted to give you a chance to tell my audience, like, what are some of the projects that you're currently working on? I know that you mentioned boxing earlier and your YouTube channel, but can you kind of put a bow on this? Like, what are some of the things that you're currently working on, and how can people get a hold of you?
Okay, great. So the book's coming out. Go to shawlinepublishing.com. I'll send you the link. You can pre-order it now. It's called the 24-hour reset. You'll learn systems, eight ways to literally optimize your day without spending a penny. This book was written for the average ma and pa, not the bodybuilder, not the athlete, not the person who thinks they know everything, the person who feels lost or stuck. Go pre-order that now, shawlinepublishing.com. My YouTube channel, maybe 14, 15 months ago, 700 subscribers. It's a slow grind. I'm at about 7,000 now. Jonny Says, JONNYSAYS. You'll find my documentaries on there. I've done a few docos on an ancient martial art out of Myanmar called Lethwei, where I traveled the world with Dave LeDuc, the world champion. It's bare knuckle Muay Thai with a headbutt's legal. That's pinned on the page. But as of late, a lot of boxing content, a lot of boxing interviews. I just sat down with Australia #1 female lightweight. She was a youth golden Commonwealth champion, Ella Boot, preparing for her next fight in a couple weeks with No Limit Promotions, the same promo that Tim Tszyu fights under. That interview's up there. Jonny Says, follow that. And I'm working on 2 more books. One about these interviews with boxers framed around personal development, and the other one about this is my 32nd month in a row of running 100 kilometers of outdoor miles, and I'm not a runner. So this book is for the person who has asthma, who has no cartilage in their left knee, talking about myself, and all the systems that have allowed me to become an outdoor runner to help better myself. So constantly creating stuff. And if you need to reach out to me, just email me. And I'll send you that. It's just my name at iCloud. It's my generic one, Jonny Stofko at iCloud. For any sort of collabs and stuff like that, I'm always helping people and doing stuff like that.
Perfect. So all the ways to get in touch with Johnny and find out more about his book, it'll be in the description of this video. Make sure you guys check that out. Johnny, I really appreciate you spending your morning with me, sir, and I hope we can do it again very soon.
Tyler, thank you for having me, and this was really fun, man.